Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode in our special five-part series. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to have back with me Jakub Ficner. Jakub, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks for having me back, Tom. Definitely looking forward to our conversation today.
Jakub, could you remind our audience of your professional background and current role?
For sure. So I'm currently the Director of Partnership Development at Case IQ. I've been working within the internal investigative space for over 15 years now.
Jakub, one of the reasons I really enjoy visiting with you for what's turned out to be multiple podcasts is you really advocate a rigor around the process, not simply reporting or speak up, but triage and investigation. So I'd really like to go through that with you and maybe start with triage. Say a report's come in, say someone's raised their hand and spoken up, or they go into their manager's office and say, "Hey, I want to tell you something." It gets to compliance. How should compliance think through the triage process, and why is the triage process so critical in fostering a speak up culture?
Yeah, for sure. I guess from a starting point, my recommendation would be to think about the assessment and triage process prior to receiving a complaint or allegation, as if you're only thinking about your how you're going to assess a case once you've received an allegation or complaint, then you're behind in terms of response time and really behind the eight ball. So that's where to really focus on how an organization can increase or encourage a speak up culture. It's about thinking about response assessment and triage prior to that allegation coming in. Once it comes in, you can assess the nature of the complaint or allegation, the severity, and have a plan in terms of what stakeholders to involve, who to notify, and next steps from there.
Used an acronym in that answer that I have not heard used in the compliance space, and it was SLA. Could you define that for us?
Yeah, it comes to a service level agreement. So it's agreed upon response times based on the nature of the allegation. When we work with organizations in terms of standardizing a process to complaints and allegations, it really focuses on what should the response be and what should the response times be in terms of those activities. So it's taking lessons and learned from customer service and applying them to internal investigations.
For my sins, I, in a past life, was a software lawyer. So I know what SLAs are or were. And the way you have phrased that strikes me. First of all, I've not heard anyone in the compliance space talk about counseling a compliance professional around the concept of an SLA, but then having the rigor to put it down in writing so that everyone knows what it is. But in my software life, that would be a standard part of a software sale. You would have to either negotiate or simply give the SLAs, and hopefully the customer would accept them. But having that written documentation gave customers comfort that if a situation did arise, it could be turned in. There would be a time frame for response. It could be escalated if necessary, and there would be different levels up. I really never thought about SLA in the context of the rigor a compliance program needs, but it seems to me to make perfectly logical sense to think of it that way. And let me even emphasize your use of the word customer, because the customer of a compliance officer are the employees. I think I heard you say you're promising your employees this is how we will respond and this is the time frame. Would that be a fair assessment?
That's exactly it. It's about setting expectations. And to be able to set realistic expectations, you have to monitor and document it and set internal expectations so that when you do receive a complaint, an allegation, a complainant, I should say, that submitted it isn't really waiting to figure out when am I going to be notified? What are the next steps? What are the expectations around when I should receive the next communication from the compliance department? By having this already thought out and documented, you can set those expectations with your employees. And really, that's where setting expectations really is the base of opening dialogue and fostering a culture of open communication.
You've really hit on something that I don't think we talk about enough in the compliance community, which is we talk about fostering a culture of speak up that you've just mentioned. We talk about encouraging people. We talk about anti-retaliation and to prevent that, to give people comfort they won't be punished if they come forward. But we don't talk about in the middle, the processes and the procedures. But it strikes me in listening to you, those can foster a culture of speak up as well, because you're setting an expectation or almost an internal promise that absent extraordinary circumstances, the services we'll provide back to you, Mr. Reporter or Ms. Reporter.
That's exactly it. As we know, it does take in certain circumstances a lot of courage to submit an allegation. And if you don't really know where it's going to go, what's going to happen, what are the next steps, it just creates more uncertainty and anxiety. And really, by having this all clearly communicated as part of your triage and assessment, that you make the complainant aware of your steps and expectations around those steps, then you are, at the end of the day, encouraging open communication and fostering that trust that you'll take the allegation seriously. You've already thought about a process, you have it documented, and you're going to meet those expectations.
How important is having a documented process for a multinational company that may have compliance officers in the United States, Canada, Latin America, Asia, Africa, or any other place?
I think as an organization size increases, the complexity of the compliance program increases, and having this all thought out prior to receiving that serious allegation becomes even more important, as even the initial assessment and triage might be more complicated. The situation might be, do we have the language requirements? Do we have the resources available to be able to support this type of investigation within that specific region? And if you receive let's say a complex accounting matter in, let's say, an Asia Pacific country, and you're just figuring this all out, that's where your time to close for that investigation is at risk in terms of extending beyond what I would consider a reasonable threshold.
In the Dodd-Frank whistleblower provisions, which is the U.S. law, which allows whistleblowers to go to the Securities and Exchange Commission, I think there's a 120-day requirement around an internal whistleblower and a company completing their investigation. So could we maybe turn from your thoughts on triage to your thoughts on an investigation protocol and how you see that, the importance of it, and how it should be utilized by a compliance department?
So once we've completed the initial assessment and we've determined, let's say, the resources required to properly assess this investigation, assign the investigative team, then it's about what are the processes that we take from there in terms of steps. Do we conduct interviews? What are the expectations around turnarounds of those interviews? How are we going to document those interviews consistently? How are we going to communicate the outcomes of each of these steps to the appropriate stakeholders? And when we're looking at all these steps, it's really about creating that process so that as it transitions from assessment to investigation, these are our stakeholders, these are our expectation around our tasks and the response time and SLAs, if I was to use it again, for those specific tasks. And that's where, when we work with clients and as they really raise the maturity of their internal compliance and investigative processes, they're able to properly document these steps and, most importantly, use that data to assess the effectiveness of their processes. As really, this isn't something that you establish once and then walk away and hope it works forever. It's a continuous improvement model. And so again, if we go to establishing the steps required to properly investigate, it's really then documentation so that you can use that data to effectively assess your investigative steps, processes, and outcomes.
That by having a process written down, you can judge or measure against that process and then move to either monitor and or improve that process based upon the findings with Is that a fair assessment of what you just said?
That would be correct.
The When you sit down, do you still in 2023, do you sit down with clients who don't have a written process or a written protocol set out, and you have to really help them understand the need to do that now? We started this podcast with you saying, do it now than rather than wait till the allegation comes in. Are you still having to have those conversations, or have we as a function matured enough that you see at least the basics of a protocol in place?
In current times, we see a basic program more often than not, and that ratio has increased year over year, which is good to see. What we're still failing to see, and even in larger multinational organizations, is an effective means of documenting and tracking that process. Oftentimes, we start off by asking, do you have written policies and procedures that govern your investigative responses? And a client will say yes. And then we'll follow up, do you have controls to monitor and document to make sure that you're following those policies and procedures? And that's still surprisingly a low number relative to where it should be.
The policies and procedures and the documentation, does that process lend itself to a technological solution or a tool where you can capture that information in a documented format that a regulator comes knocking, you can show it to them, or you have multiple people literally across the world as a part of the investigation team?
That's ultimately what we've been preaching here at Case IQ for over 20 years. Going back to something that I harp on consistently is you need to build accountability and defensibility into your process. And that's where technology really shines, is you can establish and codify your policies and procedures into a case management solution. And more importantly, you can monitor your performance against those policies and procedures so that in the future, as you say, if an auditor comes knocking, it's not, oh my God, how am I going to react to this? Who do I need to pull in? Where is this documentation? Is that investigator still with the department or the organization? It's seemingly just going to the case record, your system of record, where everything is documented, and being able to retrieve that information and, more importantly, prove to the auditor that everything is valid and true.
Jacob, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. I hope our listeners will join us for our next episode, where we take up closing the loop, improving your compliance program through a culture of speak up. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you, if our listeners wanted any more information on the topic we've discussed in this podcast, what would be the best place for them to go?
I definitely encourage visiting our website at www.caseiq.com. And encourage visiting specifically our resource center, where you can access a wealth of information, including free webinars, ebooks, and newsletters related to ethics and compliance and internal investigations.
And I'm going to shout out to the processes, procedures, and protocol forms you have there, because I have used those. And if you don't have those, or you don't have access to something like that, the Case IQ Resource Center is a fabulous resource. So check it out if you need any of that. And Jacob, once again, a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much. And I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Pleasure, Tom. Thank you.